Okay. Show me.
Hi there guys, welcome back to the Dutch SC channel. Thank you very much for tuning in for part 3 in this build series of the perfect, perfect FPV quadcopter, and it'll be a freestyle quadcopter. In case you hadn't noticed, this is not a racer, even though you can fly racing courses with a quadcopter like this anyway. So in this series I am aiming to show you how to build a well-performing quadcopter. Not only a quadcopter that flies, but flies well. That'll make you happy when you're flying FPV with it. That's the aim, right? So if you are unfamiliar with this series, I'd urge you to take a look at the intro to this series, and I'll have a link up there in the upper right corner to my intro video to this series. So again, take a look at that first please, and you'll know what this series is aimed at. In the previous video we installed the motors, and that's obviously not complicated. There's some screws involved and that's basically it. However, that video will inform you as to why I chose these specific Racerstar SIC2207 motors. I should add at this point that if you don't like these motors, maybe you don't like Racerstar at all, the Zing motors I used on my other freestyle builds last year will also perform the same basically. So if you trust Zing motors more than these Racerstar motors, they will cost a little more, but maybe for your ease of mind they'll work out better. And it's your money obviously. Again, those will work out fine as well. Okay, so we have a frame, we have motors. In this video we'll be installing our 4-in-1 ESC. And this one is from Diatone or Mamba. And why am I using this Mamba stack? Basically because it works, it's reliable, and their pricing is pretty reasonable, I think. Are they a bargain deal? Almost, but these Mamba stacks have a reputation of performing well and being reasonably priced. However, this video will mostly be general purpose. If you want to fly another 4-in-1 ESC, this how-to will apply to that as well. Okay, in this video I'm gonna show and tell you two things. How to plan out a physical installation, how you should orientate it, maybe like so, like so, like so, and how to, well, solder things up, right? Two things, pretty standard, and there's not a whole lot that can go wrong with this 4-in-1 ESCs. So let's start by taking off the top deck of our frame. I've already undone all the screws, as you can tell. And I have not clipped off any of the motor wires. So in this video we'll also plan out the length of these wires. Alright, we are obviously looking at the center of our frame. And the first thing of note is that most of these ESCs, or sometimes the frames themselves, come with plastic standoffs. Now you can definitely use them, people use them, and it works. However, I always run metal screws through my entire stick. These screws, the stick does come with screws. They are a little bit on the short side. I'm using slightly longer screws, M3 screws these are. So why am I using metal screws? Because these don't snap off. Those plastic standoffs in a crash will... Well, they won't snap off in every crash, but in a severe crash they will snap off, and it'll be a hassle to rebuild your stack. Right, so again, metal screws, and they are held in place with plastic bolts. So that'll create a washer, basically a shim, because our 4-in-1 ESC has a connector at its bottom. That connector will run to your flight controller, right? This ribbon cable. And yes, this is the bottom of our 4-in-1 ESC. And that makes this 4-in-1 ESC, and it goes for most 4-in-1 ESCs, not flat at the bottom. So again, I've got these plastic bolts also holding on my screws, right? Convenient. So This 4-in-1 ESC is meant to be mounted like so, with the tabs for your battery leads at the rear. And why am I telling you that's the way it's intended to be mounted? Well, this here will be motor number 1, motor number 2, motor number 3, motor number 4, right? In stock Betaflight setup. So if I'd wanna have my battery leads come out the side like so, they're now on this side, I definitely can mount my 4-in-1 ESC like this. I'd have to rearrange the motor order in Betaflight though. That's not a biggie, that's definitely been done before, but it'll have two other results. My battery leads will come out over here, and that might be very convenient. However, we'll also be installing a capacitor that'll also be dangling on the side of our quadcopter. And I definitely don't want that. Also, this ribbon cable, which is fragile, will also be dangling on the outside basically of our quadcopter. So if you get your quadcopter hang up in a tree, this will be damaged. Most probably. I recently damaged an antenna that I had mounted over here, for instance. So it's definitely possible if you crash your quadcopter in a tree to damage this cable. And if you damage that cable, your quadcopter will not work. And these are easily damaged. So with this being the stock, the intended way to install it, this ribbon cable is pretty well protected, right, in most frames. So I'll definitely be installing things like this. Right, so that's the first configuration. And if you are building the quadcopter with a different frame, please check that there is actually enough room underneath your 4-in-1 ESC for that connector. Mine now is seated. Well, there's no room left basically. But that's fine, this is not our flight controller, so if there is a little bit of vibration being transmitted into this 4-in-1 ESC, that's fine, right? So it does depend on your frame whether you want to mount your 4-in-1 ESC like so, or maybe you want the battery leads to come out at the front like so. In my build, in this frame, that's definitely inconvenient because there's no opening in the top plate over here. So I'll be installing our 4-in-1 like so. Right, so that's the first thing you want to plan out. How do you want to mount your 4-in-1 ESC? If you'd be building a racing quadcopter, you definitely have to consider whether there's actually room for your battery leads at the rear. And again, we'll be installing a capacitor. This thing, this big thing. So you'll have to have room over here at the back. There's definitely room in our frame, but do keep that in mind. So now that we know how we're gonna install our 4-in-1 ESC or the orientation of it, we can plan out how to route our pigtail with the XC60. Now in my quadcopter I want it to come out over here. See, there's actually a slot in the top plate over here for your battery leads to run through. So I'm going to be using that, and that'll have our battery leads come out over here more or less. I do want to keep a little bit of wiggle room, but not too much obviously. I don't want my battery leads or the XC60 connector to flop around. So let's see how we're gonna be routing our cables. Maybe we want to shorten these cables, right? However, from the looks of it, so in this ESC, in this 4-in-1 ESC, the left tab is our plus and the right tab is our ground. Keep that in mind as well. So yeah, you'll be wiggling around with your cable a little bit and to see what the optimal length of everything is. Also keep in mind that you'll be installing motor wires, so keep that in mind. But Yeah, okay, so from the looks of it, definitely my positive wire can be quite a bit shorter. I'd say a centimeter shorter. However, the ground wire has a bigger distance to travel. So I'm probably gonna keep that as is. Yeah, ground will work as it is. So while I'm doing this, I'm also keeping in mind at the rear of our frame. As you can tell, there's a 30.5 by 30.5 mounting pattern over here and a 20 by 20. Now we'll probably, and I'm not completely sure yet, but I at least want to keep the option of installing our VTX, our video transmitter, at the rear over here. There's more than enough room, right? But in my routing of these leads, I don't want to obstruct this spot over here. So in my wire routing, I definitely don't want to obstruct this spot with my wires. So yeah, that's definitely a consideration while I plan out the installation of this wire. Yeah, okay. I'm gonna clip off. Yeah, looks like a centimeter of the positive wire. And as you can tell, the shielding of the ground wire is already stripped back, so I'll have to do that myself on the positive wire. This will probably be out of focus, but should make sense what I'm doing over here. There. Right, so that's basically it for the planning of that cable. Also, the frame comes with this rubber ring, and that's intended to go around the cable and into that slot in the frame. So I definitely don't want to forget to put that rubber ring over our cable. After we've done our soldering, I won't be able to, so do that right now. Okay, now I could theoretically do my soldering with the 4-in-1 ESC in the frame, but that's pretty inconvenient. So I'll take it out and do my soldering on the bench. So, in case you hadn't noticed, I switched cameras so you could actually see something, at least I hope you can. So I'm switching on my soldering iron over here, TS100. I've got my soldering tin over here, and a metal sponge. What is this called? Metal sponge to clean the tip of my soldering iron. So what I'll start out with is pre-tinning all these motor tabs, the 12 motor tabs in all. And actually, yeah, that'll work out just fine. So my iron is still heating up. I've got a broad tip on it. These pads are pretty big, and when we go and solder on the wires, we need good heat transfer as well, obviously. Now, this isn't a how to solder a video, but let's see. And I've got the iron set to 360 degrees Celsius. So things heat up quickly. We want to do our soldering quick and dirty. No, not dirty, quickly. You don't want to have your soldering iron on a tab for half an hour, right? So I'm going to pre-tin the tip a little, so I have a good surface contact. And then I'm going to pre-tin all these tabs. There. Don't go overboard by putting a liter of tin on your tabs, but I do want to see a nice bubble somehow my iron is having a hard time. Do keep in mind, this is the first time I'm soldering on this specific 4-in-1 ESC. Looks like it requires quite a bit of temperature somehow. All right. Okay. Basically, you'd want a fan to blow out this smoke, but you wouldn't be able to hear what I'm saying if I'd use a fan. Ordinarily, I have a fan on my disc to blow away the smoke. At least do this soldering in a well-ventilated room for your own health. If you're unhappy with one of the pads, with the amount of solder you've put on, go on to the next pad and then come back to that pad that you are not happy with. Otherwise you'd be working on one pad for a long time and have it get too warm. And the electronics will thank you for doing so. There. So I'm inspecting my work, having a look if every pad has a nice even amount of solder on it. Yeah, that looks great. Now what I'm not going to be doing is pre-tinning the battery lead pads, and that's because this one has cavities for our wire, as you can hopefully see. A lot of 4-in-1 ESCs do have pads for the wires, but on these ones the wires will slot into these cavities, right? So I want to be soldering things up all at the same time for these battery leads. Now I am going to pre-tin the leads themselves. If I'd pre-tin these cavities, I know from experience, I'd have a hard time slotting in these wires afterwards. Just so you know. Yeah, so I'm gonna put the 4-in-1 ESC to the side and I'm gonna pre-tin the wires now. These are 14 gauge wires, not super duper thick, but we are building a 6S quad and the amps will be lower because of that, right? But for ease of mind, you can definitely run 12 gauge wires. Most times I do, but I had this wire. This wire is from a different build. Okay, I've got those wire ends nicely tinned up. That looks fantastic. Okay. Quite important to have a good stable platform for your work so that it doesn't wiggle around. I'm using a piece of cork. Yeah, because it'll never catch fire, that's why. So now I need a wire and I need that wire to stay in place. That's what I really want to see. Basically this looks great by now. Yeah, we've got an awesome joint for the positive wire. Now, because that ground wire is a little longer, as you can tell, I don't want it to fight me while I'm soldering things up. See, I was born with only 2 hands. And I could use a helping hand, right? A mechanical jig, but somehow I prefer to do this on a cork platform. Okay, yeah, okay, I'm ready and set. Let's solder this one up. Wait, a bit more temperature. Wait, switch my SOLDER to 380 degrees. And good very because the tip somehow is worn. Good very again, you tell me, but I'm definitely having a harder time working with this tip than I'm used to. Right, it's working. We are definitely on the right track. And soldering out the motor wires will be significantly easier, simply because the wires are thinner, and we're not soldering onto a 6-inch cable bridge. And let's inspect the bottom. Yeah, we can do a little more soldering at the bottom as well. Okay, yes, this of course. Okay, at this point you should be testing for conductivity. However, there are capacitors on this 4-in-1 ESC, so there will already be conductivity at least a bit between the positive and negative leads. You can also at this point test things. You can simply hook up your flight controller to this lead over here. Actually, let me show you. Flight controller, and that's obviously connected via this ribbon cable. There. And I'm gonna hook up my battery, and this should be the first time our flight controller comes to life, and it does. Now you might say, wait a minute, you didn't test for conductivity, and that's right. Yeah, experience, I guess. I just knew I hadn't created conductivity there. My soldering job was good enough. So, as you can hopefully see, all those LEDs, at least the LEDs on the flight controller that should light up. I can, for instance, see that my 5-volt and my VCC outputs are all, or the 5-volt bridge is alive. So this looks excellent. Yeah, that looks excellent. The next thing I want to do is, well, I'm gonna put my flight controller to the side again. I want to hook up that capacitor. This capacitor, the flight controller, this stack comes with a massive 1000 microfarad capacitor. Pretty a huge thing actually. Now, going back to how I planned to mount this 4-in-1 ESC, I hope you remember that I mentioned that I might want to mount my VTX over here in the frame, right? At the same level basically as my 4-in-1 ESC, at ground level. So when I go on and solder up this capacitor, I don't want it to be super duper low. Otherwise I can't mount a VTX over here. I hope that makes sense. So this 4-in-1 ESC has 2 holes over here. Hope you can see them. 2 holes, and those holes are meant for the legs, these legs on my capacitor. Yeah, so again, I don't want to have these legs on my capacitor be too short, but in case you don't know, these legs on the capacitor can't be very long either, because the resistance of these wires or legs is pretty high. If you want to mount your capacitor far away from this spot over here, you'll have to extend these legs with thicker wire. Yeah, how thick, I don't know, I never do. I always mount the capacitor as close to my 4-in-1 ESC as I can. Also, obviously, take into consideration the polarity of a capacitor like this. Now, the capacitors usually have a band on one side which has a different color. This capacitor is predominantly bluish, dark blue, and it has this gold band, and that's in most 99% of the cases that discolored, that different color band is the ground side. So on this ESC, this over here is the ground side, as you can see from the black wire. So our capacitor will be situated like so. And I'm splitting out these legs so they will meet these holes, more or less. And then I'll run them through. Now, I have to add to that most of these 4-in-1 ESCs do not have these holes. This is definitely a convenient aspect or feature of this stack by Diatone. The previous version didn't have this feature. So yeah, pretty nice. And usually one of the legs on the capacitor is a little longer, so I'm gonna clip that off. We definitely don't want the two legs to meet in the middle. That would be disastrous. So let's switch on my soldering iron again. Still have the broad tip on it. And then I'm going to solder things together, or basically the capacitor to the battery leads. So that's what that looks like, and obviously you want to check if the connection is physically strong, wiggle it around a little, but yeah, that should be that. And at this point I'm going to be installing the 4-in-1 ESC in the frame, and some people solder up the motor wires with the motors not attached to the frame, but I want to plan out the length of every wire. So I'm going to install the 4-in-1 in the frame. Alright, second time I'm switching cameras in this video. Yeah, I had me a rolling shutter thing with the GoPro camera. I'm not sure how a cheap SJ cam, which I'm using now, does better than an expensive GoPro. But I'm sure the GoPro is better at other things, as for instance the light handling, the image. Okay, let's see. I've done things off screen. Let me remove my flight controller. There. As I said a second ago, I installed the 4-in-1 ESC into the frame, as you can tell. And I've soldered up one side of the motors, the left two motors I've soldered up, so I can show you what that looks like. Now, you have a choice here. You might have seen quadcopters in which this has been done, with the wires wrapped over the 4-in-1 ESC, so that they are basically out of sight, right? You can see the soldering at the side of the 4-in-1 ESC, but on top of this will be your flight controller, and these wires will be out of sight. Now the second option would be to simply solder up the motor wires straight to the 4-in-1 ESC like so. And there are definitely quadcopters in which this is done. Maybe you've built quadcopters like this. And this will work, obviously, and it'll save you a little bit of wire. It doesn't really help you in maintainability, since you will still need to probably remove the flight controller if you want to solder up new motors. Maybe you've damaged one motor and you want to replace it. That's a pretty common occurrence in this hobby, right? So with the motor's wires like this, you could think, I can reach them more easily, so I can replace that motor more easily. That's not really the case. Again, that flight controller will sit on top of the 4-in-1 ESC, and it'll be in the way of you soldering up a new motor. So why then do I do this? Since it adds a few grams, not a whole lot, but it does add a few grams of extra wire. Well, mostly for reliability. See, sometimes you crash your quadcopter, right? Definitely. Sometimes you crash it into branches, trees. And if you have your wires hanging out on the side over here, there is a definite chance of them catching something, a branch or anything else. And as you can tell on this side, there is no chance of that. Well, no chance. There's very, very little chance of the wires being snagged up by a branch. So that's simply, well, that's the reason why I go ahead and wrap my wires over the 4-in-1 ESC and solder them up like this. It also looks neat, especially once the quadcopter is finished, but that's not really the main reason why aesthetics do play a part, but that's not the main reason. I do this for reliability. And some people will say, yeah, this will interfere, electrical noise and such. I've never found that to be the case, and I've built a lot of quadcopters like this. Especially not on the Diatone stacks. I mostly use these Diatone stacks, and again, this simply works, right? So that's why I'm doing it like so. So the next thing we need to do is measure out how long these wires need to be, right? So yeah, that's a pretty simple thing. Do keep in mind that you will in a minute mount your flight controller on top of this, so be mindful of the wires not sitting on top of the plastic nut you have here. I've got 4 plastic nuts, in case you didn't notice. I've got 4 plastic nuts holding down the 4-in-1 ESC, and it'll act as a spacer as well, but well, partly they are holding the 4-in-1 ESC in place while I'm working on it, but also in flight. So again, make sure that these motor wires don't sit on top of that nut, otherwise you'll have an uneven spacing over the 4 standoffs. So this should make sense, right? You take a little bit of time wrapping around your motor wires until you are pleased with what you see, and my hands will be in the way. So I'll cut this part of the video and then I'll show you what I came up with. So I clipped all these 6 wires to size. Should fit. I must admit that I have a tendency of clipping off the wires slightly too short. Well, let's see. On this side things worked out well, so let's hope I did that again. The next thing we need to do is strip the wire ends so we can actually solder them up to these pads. Now the question could be, how much of the end of that wire do you actually strip off? Right, do we strip off a centimeter of wire, 2 centimeters, 1 millimeter, how much? Well, a simple rule of thumb is that you want to strip off the size of these pads, and those look to be approximately 4 millimeters, but you want that exposed wire to be soldered up to this pad, right? You want as much contact as you can, and exposing more wire than these pads are wide wouldn't result in anything, would be useless. So again, take as a rule of thumb the size, the width of these solder pads on your 4-in-1 ESC, and you'll be good. Again, that's approximately, I'd say, 4 millimeters. So I'm using a side cutter, as you can see. Came with my 3D printer, thank you very much. You can use a scalpel as well if you want something sharp. And since we are using good motors in this build, these wires have a nice silicone coating which can be stripped off pretty easily. Obviously you want to make sure to not clip off the actual wire itself. That's where something sharp comes in. We are on the home stretch, by the way, in case you are wondering. You can probably also see that from the video timer, the time slider at the bottom of the video. Okay, done. Next thing we'll do is roll up these wire ends, so you don't have those pesky wire hairs hanging around. Those are a sure thing of creating shorts, which is not not beneficial. So, and the next thing we'll do is pre-tin these wires. And for this I've got my soldering iron set to 380 degrees Celsius. It's warming up as we speak. So get your soldering tin ready. Preferably you'd do this not over your electronics. And I'm not sure what it'll look like, but I will be soldering just left to the right for you of my 4-in-1 ESC. But because of the perspective it might look different. Okay. So simply touch the wire with your soldering iron and then touch the wire from the other side with your tin, and the tin will be pulled in, at least that's what it'll look like, pulled into the wire. You'll actually see it boil a bit. You won't see that in the video, but if you are doing this in real life, you'll see the solder, probably the flux in the solder wire boil off a bit, which is what you want. Again, ordinarily I'd have a fan on my desk to blow away the fumes. Hotchikidee. Done. Basically, you can now put your soldering tin away. There's soldering tin on the pads and on your wires. That's all the soldering tin you'll need. You should need. Okay, next thing I always use is a, what is this, a vernier caliper, vernier plier thing, you know what this is. And I'll use that to hold the wire in place. The wires might get warm, could well get warm. Also, your fingers will be too thick to really get in there. And it is also handy to do a little bit of a test run to see if you can reach things comfortably. See if you're going to be overstressing yourself, or maybe you find that holding the wire in place will have your elbow not rest on the table and be stable. That would be awkward and will result in a bad soldering job. So do a bit of a test run to see what works comfortably. So I've got that caliper over here and I'm now looking to see if I can hold that wire in place exactly at the spot I want to, and that I have a steady hand, right? And I do. So I take the soldering iron again. I've got more than enough soldering flux on the wire and on the tab, so I don't need extra soldering tin, and I press the wire into that tin that's on the pad. And when I pull my iron away, I should see a nice and even puddle of soldering tin in which the wire is fused into. I hope that all makes sense. If that's the case, you most likely have a good soldering joint. Now I'm also, as you can hopefully see, working the wires into shape so that they won't fight me, which is not what you want. Again, you want all this to be as easy as possible so that you can keep things exactly in place without stressing yourself or the wire. Alright, I've got it lined up and I'm pressing the wire into that flux puddle and presto. Okay, last one. Again, I'm twisting the wire in shape so that it won't fight me. And there we go. Okay, you can obviously, you should also give the wires a little bit of a tug to see if the physical connection is good. And that's it. That's soldering up the motor wires to your 4-in-1 ESC. Pretty well simple. This wasn't always simple for me. A couple of years ago I hated soldering, but I've done so much soldering that I still hate it. But I'm pretty, I can hold my own. And I'm sure there are people watching this video in horror thinking, what kind of soldering is that? Well, guess what? It'll work, which is the main thing here. And yes, there will definitely be people that do better soldering jobs. Okay, I'm gonna do the same thing on the last 3 wires of the 4th motor, and then I'll show you what I came up with again. Hard cheeky day. And done. We've got 4 motors connected to our 4-in-1 ESC. We've got a big old capacitor, and I'm not sure if you'll be able to see that, but there's a space in between the bottom plate and this capacitor, leaving me room for, well, a VTX if I'd want to. And these wires will go here. My battery leads will go here, so those won't be in the way. That worked out pretty well. Again, make sure that the motor wires don't sit on top of these nuts, standoffs, so that our flight controller will sit flush. I forgot to mention, and it's not all that important, but before you put your 4-in-1 ESC in place for the last time, so before you go and solder up the motor wires, it is handy to put this ribbon cable that will run to your flight controller, to put that on, because I can now not really reach that connector anymore. I could, but I'd have to remove my camera cage at the front over here. So, well, if I had forgotten that, I would have had to remove a couple of screws, but it's handy to put that in before you put your 4-in-1 ESC in place for the last time. Yeah, sorry I forgot to mention that. Let's see, what more can I tell you about this? Not much more. In the next video we'll be installing the flight controller itself. So prepare all the connections to your camera, to the VTX, to your receiver. And is that it? Maybe LEDs if you'd want to. So we'll do that in the next video. I want to again make this series as detailed as possible in case you haven't built a quadcopter yet at all. So this video series should give you at least an insight and a lead into building any quadcopter, and especially if you'd use this Diatone stack, and well, I'm using this Catalyst Machineworks BangGOD frame in this build series. So if you'd be using all these components, you can 100% follow along, I guess. So yeah, also, again, I'm sure that some people that are watching are better at soldering or better at other things. Leave a comment down below, maybe not for me, but for other viewers to inform them, right? If I've got things wrong, even though I can, well, I know this will work, but maybe things can be done better. So I'm always open to that, and again, might be informative to your colleague viewer, so don't hesitate to add your comments. Thank you very much in advance. In the next installment in this series, again, we'll be installing our flight controller. Be on the lookout for that. Catch you on the next video. Bye bye.